Welcome to Lesson 3. Today, we'll be going over the unique characteristics of all the four Gospels, and Lesson 3 as overall will be about the words, deeds, and teachings of Jesus. There are four Gospels, the first of which is Matthew's Gospel. This Gospel, more than any other, seeks to show how Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. So more than any other Gospel, Matthew will hearken back to stories of the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills. He does this primarily in his genealogy, where he traces Jesus back to David and to Abraham to show that he is the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham to bring blessing to all nations, as well as the promises made to David that a king will sit on the throne of Israel forever. Matthew himself was a Jewish tax collector. He became an apostle. Matthew is not his Jewish name. Because he was a tax collector, he worked for the Romans, so he was called Matthew. His Jewish name was Levi. Matthew is one of the two authors of the Gospels that was an actual apostle, and his Gospel was traditionally held to be the earliest one written. When I was in high school, my teacher gave me the assignment to choose one of the four Gospels and read them. Looking through the chapters, I noticed that Mark was the shortest, so that is the one I read. It is very short, and it is fast-paced. He spends a lot of time going over as many teachings as Jesus, as much as his healing ministry and his actions. Mark was written for persecuted Christians, particularly those in Rome. Mark himself was not one of the 12 apostles. He was a disciple of Peter, probably got most of his information from Peter. He also knew Paul very well, but most of his information came from the apostolic source, St. Peter. Luke is the only author of the New Testament who was not a Jew. Luke himself was a Gentile. Gentile just means non-Jew. Obviously, because he wasn't a Jew, he was neither an apostle. He is the only gospel author who sets out to give us what he calls an orderly account. Luke would go and interview people to get as close to the historical situation as he possibly could. It was important for Luke to give us this because he wanted to make sure that people knew that this wasn't some kind of mythology. This was history. Luke is the only gospel writer who followed up his gospel with a sequel, which is called Acts of the Apostles. And Luke's main audience were Gentile Christians. This is important because Luke himself is a Gentile. And because of this, Luke is the only author to give us certain stories like the story of the Good Samaritan, where the good guy in the story is not a Jewish person. Last, we have John's Gospel. This is actually my favorite of the four Gospels. John was one of the 12 apostles, and not only that, he was actually within the inner three. Jesus had a primary disciple in Peter. Peter was his right-hand man. He gave him the keys to the kingdom, and he made him the rock on which he'd build the church. But he also had a group of three, of Peter, James, and John, who would go with him on special occasions, like up on Mount Tabor and into the Garden of Gethsemane. And John was one of those three. John's Gospel is the only one to give us a 3-year ministry of Jesus preaching and teaching. The other Gospels gave us more like a 1-year timeline, but John gives us 3. His Gospel is also focused more on what Jesus said and did in Jerusalem, whereas the other Gospels are more about what Jesus said and did in Galilee. John's Gospel, more than any other, focuses on sacramental images. He talks more about baptism, about the Eucharist, than any of the other Gospels. John's Gospel also more clearly identifies who Jesus is in relationship to his Father. So the idea that Jesus is God is very, very clear in John's Gospel.